Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the PRAC, the Praires Regional Adaptation Collaborative's webinar on the value of natural infrastructure. My name is Joellen Perry, and I am the Adaptation Lead at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which acts as Secretariat for the PRAC. The PRAC is a cost-share program of the governments of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, along with Natural Resources Canada. And the aim of this initiative is to increase the capacity of government and civil society decision makers on the prairies to understand, prepare for, and take action to address the implications of our changing climate. This is the fourth webinar hosted by the PRAC over the past year. In each of these previous webinars, we've sought to highlight the adaptation efforts of municipalities and Indigenous communities in the prairie provinces. These past events have covered how to build the resilience of flood infrastructure, tools for municipal adaptation planning, and the mental health impacts of climate change. Recordings and presentations from each of these previous webinars are posted on the PRAC website. Today's webinar focuses on how municipalities are advancing adaptation to climate change through better management of natural infrastructure assets that provide municipal and ecosystem services. We will begin with two presentations that provide an introduction to natural infrastructure and evaluation. These will be followed by several case studies showing how municipalities are utilizing and valuing natural infrastructure to enhance their resilience to a changing climate. Our speakers today are Dimple Roy, the Director of Water Management at IISD, Andrea Curley, a Manager at the Intact Center for Climate Adaptation, Nasha Spence, Environmental Accounting Manager for the City of Saskatoon, Guy Greenaway, Senior Project Manager at the Miistakis Institute, and Amanda Legros, Planner for the Town of Cochrane. Each of these presenters will speak for about 15 minutes. There will be an opportunity to raise questions following the presentations. Please write your questions in the questions panel at any time during the presentations, and we will answer as many of them as possible before the end of the webinar. So to get things started, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dimple Roy, who's the Director of Water Management at IISD. She will be providing us with an introduction to key concepts and issues related to natural infrastructure.
Thanks very much, Joellen, and thank you for the opportunity to present an overview of natural infrastructure and the role that it plays in climate adaptation based on some of the work that we've done here at IISD. So I was asked to answer the question, what is natural infrastructure? And instead of providing a 3-minute presentation, I decided to elaborate on it, talking about what is natural infrastructure, what it isn't, how natural infrastructure can play a role in improving our resilience to the impacts of climate change, and then providing some key insights from a forum that IISD and partners convened in the fall of 2018. So natural infrastructure is being defined in a variety of ways by folks in the Canadian context. So Infrastructure Canada has talked about the use of natural resources such as plants, soils, wetlands, particularly to mitigate impacts of climate change or natural hazards. The Canadian Council for Ministers of the Environment highlight the role of ecological processes and ecosystems to generate infrastructure outcomes. And while this is, I think of the definition of natural infrastructure as kind of evolving, IISD in a report that we put out earlier this year really highlighted two aspects of a good definition: the need for active management of natural systems. So passive natural systems may or may not provide us with these benefits, but the active restoration and management of natural systems is necessary. And then the need for the delivery of those infrastructure benefits is what makes natural infrastructure. And then the second part of defining natural infrastructure is to highlight that, in fact, natural infrastructure is different from green infrastructure, which is a term that's used quite commonly in the context of Canadian infrastructure programming and funding. So as I said, natural infrastructure is really naturalized systems that are managed actively for those infrastructure outcomes and benefits, and include things like wetlands and green spaces and woodlots. Green infrastructure can include not only natural systems, but also built systems that have a positive environmental outcome. So green infrastructure is defined by the fact that they provide environmental outcomes and can in fact be quite built. They can include, for example, wastewater treatment facilities and rapid transit systems and wind farms and permeable paving that have environmental outcomes. And then finally, the traditional way we all understand infrastructure is built or gray infrastructure systems that are constructed primarily by humans to provide us with those infrastructure outcomes that we've required for our communities to grow. Just to highlight what role natural infrastructure plays in the context of increasing climate risk, a report that came out last year led by the Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation along with IISD, Insurance Bureau of Canada and others, really talked about the need for natural infrastructure in the context of flood resilience in particular. This is a great report for anyone who's interested. It's on the Intact Centre website. But the two main outcomes from this report that I wanted to highlight is that risks and costs associated with climate hazards are increasing tremendously or have increased tremendously over the past decade. So the numbers that were in the report were that in the period between 1983 and 2008, so about a decade ago, the average annual property and casualty insurance losses were $405 million in Canada. And these property and casualty insurance losses went up to $1.8 billion in the last decade, in the period between about 2009 and 2017. So we're seeing a 3- to 4-fold increase in the insurance costs that are associated with, particularly associated with water damage in Canada, and insurance options, which are mechanisms that we've used traditionally as a primary coping mechanism in relation to these risks, are becoming increasingly unviable. The second insight from this report was that natural infrastructure, demonstrated by case studies from across Canada, such as in BC, Manitoba, Ontario, are really providing cost-effective solutions for these increasing risks. So we're seeing really good benefit cost ratios from wetlands and water retention projects and other forms of natural infrastructure across the country. And not only are they providing really good cost-effective solutions to climate risks, they're also providing us with a host of co-benefits that traditional gray systems don't necessarily provide. So they really are, can be seen as complements to gray infrastructure systems, if not in some cases alternatives to gray infrastructure systems in the context of increasing climate risks. One example that was in the report and a project that IISD has been involved in for over a decade is Pelly's Lake in southwestern Manitoba, where we've been working with proponents in the LaSalle Red Point Conservation District and landowners in the vicinity to retain floodwater. So that's primarily the flood risk management benefit that we're getting, but we're also getting a bunch of benefits like it's a source of biomass that can be used for bioenergy and for livestock bedding and other uses. It sequesters nutrients and improves the water quality going into downstream waters. It's providing us with measurable carbon offsets that we've plugged into a voluntary market, and other recreational and habitat benefits that are recognized by local and regional stakeholders. And this is one of the projects that highlights the 3-to-1 cost-benefit ratio. So it really is a valuable project in the context of natural infrastructure. And then just to highlight some of the key insights that came out of a forum that IISD hosted along with partners like ALICE Canada and the Insurance Bureau of Canada in November last year, where we really wanted to talk about how to accelerate the planning and implementation around natural infrastructure in Canada. And we talked about existing programs and potential funding mechanisms and barriers and drivers of implementation. And I'll highlight, I did provide the link to the event page. There's a natural infrastructure event page on our website, and presentations and a forum report are available there. But I thought it would be worthwhile to highlight some of the key insights. Some of the insights simply kind of reinforced some of the findings from the Intact Center report. We are seeing increasing risks due to events such as extreme floods, and natural infrastructure can play a significant role in mitigating some of these risks. We highlighted the role of government infrastructure funding programs such as the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program and the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and how these infrastructure funds are I should say, allowing for natural infrastructure projects, but are targeted more at the green infrastructure projects that I talked about earlier. So that they are focusing more on projects such as wastewater treatment plants and green transportation systems that have that environmental outcome. They don't yet have specific elements that really enable natural infrastructure projects. So there are some practical barriers in these programs such that natural infrastructure projects are not able to access many of these funds due to land ownership issues or minimum threshold issues and so on. Some emerging mechanisms, again in the context of green infrastructure, are, we did talk about them. So green bonds, resilience bonds, social impact investing, private sector investment mechanisms do exist in that green infrastructure space again, but need to be adapted to think about the spatial and temporal uncertainty that comes with natural infrastructure. And in that same vein, the need for strong performance metrics, standards, means for us to replicate natural infrastructure systems in a more standardized way need to be developed so that private investment can be deployed in this context. And then some of the other insights were that there are many opportunities. There are some really good things happening out there. Organizations like ALICE Canada are working with private landowners on agricultural lands, really pulling together private funding and public funding to provide incentives to landowners. Groups such as the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative are working with municipalities to lobby, for example, to include natural assets in the federal public service accounting framework, such that these assets are included in operational budgets at the municipal levels and then maintained the same way as one would maintain a road or a bridge. And then finally, conversations like the one we convened and the one that we're having today, where we bring together experts from different fields. Interdisciplinary experts are actually really important. They're important in building shared understanding and building the momentum as we move towards trying to get more natural infrastructure out there in the context of improved climate resilience. And that's it from me. Thanks very much again, and happy to be part of this discussion.
Great. Thank you, Dimple. I will now turn the webinar over to our next presenter, Andrea Curley, who's the manager at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. Andrea supports the day-to-day operations of the Intact Center, as well as oversees research on best practices to address extreme heat in urban communities across Canada. Unfortunately, Andrea is going to have to leave the webinar after making this presentation in order to catch a flight. So there won't be an opportunity to raise questions related to her presentation, but if you want to put them into the chat, we can forward those directly to her, and we can also perhaps send an email to the PRAC Secretariat afterwards if you would like. So with that, Andrea, I turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me today. So in my presentation today, I'm going to be talking about climate change and specifically the extreme weather that is associated with it. So this first slide here really does a great depiction of the work that the INTAC Center has been doing and where we're going moving forward. If you look at the top two photos, it shows flooding, and this is where most of our emphasis of work has been on, focusing on flood resilience and how to prevent the top two photos from happening, which is at home and community flood levels, and then help Canadians to decrease the impacts associated with them. And the bottom two photos shows where our new areas of focus are going to be: wildlife resilience and extreme heat and the impacts that are associated with them. So quickly, just to review an agenda for today, I'm first going to go over the nature and challenges that are associated with climate change and extreme weather. And specifically, I will speak to how flooding can impact catastrophic insurable loss, which Dimple did touch upon briefly there. I won't delve too far into it just because she just did, but I'll make a few points. Then I'll look at mortgage arrear risk for residential homes and the mental health implications of Canadians who had to live through these flooding events. After I finish depressing you with all of those findings, I'm going to provide you with some adaptation examples that work to decrease the impacts of floodings on Canadians and the communities that they reside in. Specifically in the areas that the INTAC Center has been focusing our time on is developing guidelines and standards on professional training and flood resilience in the areas of the home, new community design, existing community retrofit, and commercial real estate. And I'll touch upon how natural infrastructure can play a role in that flood resilience. And lastly, I'll outline some new areas of focus at the INTAC Center, which, as I mentioned, is wildfire and urban, extreme urban heat. And if I don't know if this is feasible, but if I do have some time at the end, maybe I can take some quick questions right after the presentation. So Dimple did have this picture on her slide, and so I won't, as I mentioned, I won't go too far into detail, but as she mentioned, what you see here is the data on catastrophic insurable losses for Canada for the property and casualty insurance sector, and this was prepared by the Insurance Bureau of Canada. So this shows the catastrophic insurable loss as a function of time. So on the x-axis, you can see the annual catastrophic losses. It shows the years. And on the y-axis, it shows the billions of catastrophic losses paid out by insurance. So just to note, in order to even get on this graph and to be classified as catastrophic insurable loss, the event had to cost more than $25 million or more. So those events may include a big wildfire, a hailstorm, a flood event, whatever that major event was, it needed to cost $25 million or more to be depicted on this graph. So let's say, for example, that a flood event only cost 24 million. It is not demonstrated on here. So as Dimple mentioned, one of the first things that you see is between 1983 and 2008, the average insurable loss came in at around 500 million, with obviously the few exceptions. You see the Eastern ice storm and the Quebec floods, for example. But come 2009 onwards, every single year except for 2015, that catastrophic insurable loss exceeds $1 billion. And you can see that that red trend line associates that increase. So why is that trend line going up? So in the last decade, 50% of what explains this increase is water damage, excluding that Fort McMurray fire. So too much water in the wrong place. So obviously flooding is the elephant in the room in our country, and we need to address flooding first and foremost as it comes to extreme weather events. So another thing to note on that Dimple did say is that this is simply a metaphor for the overall economic costs associated with extreme weather in Canada. And that's because typically insurance doesn't cover all of the costs associated with the event. For every $1 of insured loss, there is $3 to $4 of uninsured loss that needs to be paid out by governments and businesses or individuals that they need to cover. So in order to see a total economic cost of this, you would have to multiply this graph by 3 to 4 times. So therein lies the problem. In order to tackle the risk of the economics of extreme weather, we need to first look at flooding. So we talked about insurance and Dimple mentioned on it, but what does that mean for the average Canadian? So what we're finding is that there are communities in Canada that have been flooded multiple times. So now it's becoming a chronic problem. And in some of these areas, homeowners are either no longer able to receive insurance coverage at all. So what happens when they get another flood? They have to pay for that out of their own pocket. And in other instances, when they can receive flood insurance, it's so costly that the homeowner wouldn't be able to afford it, for example. Or maybe when you can afford it, it has a very low cap limit. So on the bottom right corner of the screen, you can see that the average cost of a flooded basement is $40,000. So if you are able to afford insurance and you do get insurance, but you have a low cap limit, and let's say, for example, it's only $10,000, the homeowner still needs to come up with that $30,000 out of pocket. And this is problematic because according to the Canadian Payroll Association of Canada, 50% of Canadians live paycheck to paycheck and only have $2,000 in savings per month for emergencies. So again, if it costs you that average $40,000 to fix a home and you live in one of those areas where it's now a chronic problem, you may have been fortunate enough for the first flood that you have that $40,000 saved up and you're able to pay for it. But if you live in these areas where there's like the second flood, the third flood, you've likely exhausted your savings. And so it's very difficult to come up with that $40,000. But in the meantime, you still need to pay your other bills, one of those being mortgages. And so this really shows that there's a risk of mortgage arrears growing, because what do? Do you go ahead and fix your flooded basement, or do you move forward and pay your mortgage? And this was actually seen after Hurricane Harvey and Irma in the United States, where 140,000 mortgages were over 90 plus days delinquent by December 2017. And this represented 20% of all the severely delinquent loans in the United States. So this shows you that if it's happening there, it can happen here too. But additionally, in some flood circumstances, homeowners have to fix their homes not only because they feel the need to and they don't want mold or anything like that, but it can become a rising health concern. And this is especially true in regards to sewers. If you have sewer water entering the home, you need to get rid of it within 3 to 4 days, or else the home becomes uninhabitable. So just to do that, it costs $10,000. So it's apparent that you need to have money at your disposal in order to fix a flood-related event. And furthermore, when we're discussing things about finances, Canadians that live through flood events, there was found a correlation through a study that we completed that there are mental health implications. So we completed a study with Manulife where we went to Burlington, which was flooded in 2014 and over 3,000 homes were flooded. And we went back there and we surveyed 100 people in a sample neighborhood in 2017, so 3 years after the flood, who lived through that storm, and said, hey, we're going to ask you a few questions. Are you worried about when it rains? From living through that flood, did you have to take time off work? If so, how much? And we found two key findings from this study. So first, those people that had to live through a flood event, they took an average of 7 days off work. Now remember, we just discussed how stressful this can be financially to the homeowner. Now imagine having to take 7 days off work in order to fix your damages. So that could add some additional mental health stresses as well. Also, when we ask, are you worried if it rained, 50% of people say they're still worried that when it rains, so much so that some of them state that they don't sleep at night just to continually check on their basements. So you can understand now there's the financial stress and now there's mental health implications, how this could really impact an individual's life after such events as flooding. So after we find all these terrible things out, what can we do? What are the solutions? So that's what we've been working on at the Intact Center. And specifically, I'm going to highlight some of the national initiatives that we've been working on. And what we've done is we've developed guidelines and standards for flood resilience that can be applied to improve resilience at the home level, new community design, existing community retrofits, and commercial real estates. And one of the first questions that may come up in your mind is, why have we been focusing on working to develop guidelines and standards? Well, because we heard from insurance industries, banks, and credit rating agencies that in order to provide financial incentives, there needs to be a recognized guideline or standard, or better yet, a building code that verifies flood resilience. So just to touch briefly on each one of these 4 sectors, at the level of the home, the Canadian Standards Association, the CSA group, developed a guideline on flood protection for home, and it outlines 50 or so ways that a home can be built or retrofitted to improve its flood resilience. So for example, these can include things like installing backwater valves on sewers to help reduce risk, disconnecting downspouts from sewer pipes, pointing them at a safe distance from the home, and regrading the house so that water flows away from the home and doesn't pool near your home. And these are just a few suggestions that the CSA group has outlined for retrofitting of a home. For new community design standard, in 2017, we published the report Preventing Disaster Before It Strikes, which profiles 20 or so best practices on flood resilience in building new communities. And this can include things like not building on a floodplain, preservation of natural vegetation, and appropriately sizing sewer infrastructure so that increased water can accommodate that. So for now, this was going to be produced as a national standard come this year. And similar to something like building with LEED Energy certified, where you can have energy efficiency related to your home, you'll be able to now certify communities as flood resilient in accordance with the standard. So this will be turning into a national standard this year. And this is really good because some insurance companies, as mentioned about standards and guidelines, have actually come to the table to say, hey, this is valuable. Homeowners that are going to go look and buy within these communities that are certified as flood resilience may benefit from lower insurance premiums on their home because these communities are safer from flood risk. And by buying a certified flood resilient community, that gives you some peace of mind. So that was a benefit as a homeowner, but also as the insurance company. Thirdly, we also developed the standard for existing community flood retrofits, and this report outlines how to work within communities to make each individual community more flood resilient in regards to challenges they face with flooding, because each community will have different issues. It's not uniform throughout the country. So then they can use this to guide how they should move forward with existing communities, and this will also be turning into a standard this year. And lastly, for commercial real estate, we are working with the 2 industry associations in Canada, REALPAC and BOMA, that represent commercial building owners and managers to develop an industry guideline on how to retrofit office towers for flood resilience. And to touch on why this is important, you may remember back in 2018, Toronto had a flood that nearly killed 2 men. And for those of you that don't know the story, what happened was there was a flooding event that happened, and the men wanted to go and make sure that their cars were okay. So they went down in the elevator onto Parkade 4. And once the elevator hit water, it got stuck. It wouldn't open, it wouldn't move up. So the elevator started filling with water, so much so that the gentleman had to stand on handrails. And with only a few inches of water left within, a few inches of air left within the elevator, 2 police officers dove down with crowbars and opened up the elevator to ensure that these men could get out. So seeing here that people could potentially die shows that there definitely needs to be adaptation measures that need to be implemented, such as a sensor that may be able to sense water at the elevator and say, okay, we're going to send you right up to the ground floor versus opening the doors or stalling. So this is just to reiterate that, again, companies are listening and seeing the value in flood resilient. This is a statement from Intact Financial that reads, by taking these steps, Canadians could lower their annual premiums anywhere from 5 to 15%. So it shows that not just environmental organizations are taking action, but also corporate organizations. And what we had the issue was saying, okay, we've got all these great findings, but how do we communicate that? So, because we figured that not every homeowner is going to go download and read these guidelines on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. So we said, okay, how do we get this word out? So at the Intake Center, we worked with colleges across Canada, and they implemented flood resilient modules that feeds into the certification training for home inspector certification. And this is great because when people are buying and selling homes, then they can have that conversation at that level to say, hey, these are the things that you can do to your home to make it more flood resilient. And there are around 40,000 home inspectors across Canada. We also work with the Insurance Broker Association of Canada to train insurance brokers, and this is a very short course, and it educates insurance brokers in Canada on what homeowners can do to minimize flood risk. So then when they're speaking to flood owners about their insurance packages, they can say, hey, have you ever thought about this in order to decrease your chance of getting damage from a flood event? And there's approximately 38,000 insurance brokers across Canada. So lastly, we did a pilot. We're currently doing a pilot with the Red Cross, where we're training Red Cross volunteers to knock on homes in Windsor, Squamish, and Red Deer. And during this time, the volunteer knocks on the home, talks to the homeowner about practical things they can do around their home to reduce flood risk. And then in a few weeks, the volunteers return back to the home, and there are to see if they've actually implemented these things and see if they're working. And there are about 12,000 volunteers across Canada. So now it's another group of people. So between 40,000 home inspectors, 38,000 insurance brokers, and 12,000 Red Cross volunteers, you now have this little army that is advocating for flood risk resilience and what people can do at the home level in order to decrease the chance of having damages associated. Dimple touched really briefly on this, so I will not go into it because I see I'm over my time. But anyways, we completed this report, as Dimple mentioned, with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, as well as the Insurance Bureau of Canada. And really, we wanted to explore and come to some conclusions in some findings that outlines the utility of natural infrastructure for flood resilience. And there are case studies, as Dimple mentioned, that have assessed the economic value of natural infrastructure, such as wetlands and ponds and green spaces and flood resilience. And also the report outlines that there's a framework on how practitioners can assess the economic value of natural infrastructure in dollars and cents, so they can see how valuable those wetlands or ponds are in relation to resilience, not just on their ecological impacts, but on their financial contributions. Again, Dimple touched on this really briefly. Because I'm getting close to my time, I'll just do a quick case study. So there's quite a few out there, but we completed one in Waterloo at the Intact Center, and we said, okay, we want to explore the benefits of wetland conservation in both rural and urban municipalities. And we wanted to explore two things. Does natural infrastructure like wetlands and ponds decrease flood damages, so therefore the costs that are associated with them? So essentially, do these things act like a sponge in order to absorb rainwater to help reduce flood damage? And what we did is we tested 2 pilot sites, one in Waterloo with the Grand River Conservation Authority, and then 3 sites in Mississauga with the Credit Valley Conservation Authority. And from the urban pilot site, the study found that if wetlands are maintained in their natural state in a 1 in 500 year storm, so that's like a Hurricane Hazel, they could reduce flood damages associated with buildings, homes, apartments within an urban city center by up to over 50 million. So by leaving those wetlands in their natural state, it is valuable for flood attenuation, acting like that sponge, and therefore decreasing the financial implications that are associated with flooding. So the secondary point that we wanted to make sure that we wanted to explore is say, hey, can we develop framework to compare the cost-benefit analysis for green versus gray infrastructure? So we know that nature can be a strong complement to gray infrastructure for flood attenuation, but what is really important is that we are transparent in the way that we report the costs and benefits for natural infrastructure versus gray infrastructure. So of course, all of the case studies that are out there, and the one that I mentioned does have costs associated with them. There's construction costs and post-construction costs, but they also have benefits associated. So let's say we want to compare a wetland versus a stormwater tank. A wetland is much like a stormwater tank in the sense that it can provide attenuation and for water and act as that sponge. But a wetland can also have numerous other benefits. So that could be carbon sequestration, water quality, habitat, biodiversity. And then you look at the gray stormwater tank, and can it provide that? Well, no. So in order to compare green versus gray, you need to capture this holistically. If you're only going to compare the 2 strategies based on cost, you need to analyze all the benefits associated with that cost. A wetland can provide many more benefits than simply just storing water, and we need to highlight that in order to fairly compare the green versus gray. You need to be able to quantify those green benefits, like habitat creation, for example. So we develop a framework at the Intact Center to compare in dollars and cents what is the best practice to implement, green, gray, or both. And that's it for me.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrea. There is one question that I think I will ask you before you have to leave. It's a quick yes or no question. So Sarah Prescott, who is with the All One Sky, has asked, in this graphic that you presented at the beginning of the presentation, looking at the costs of the different extreme events that have occurred in Canada, the $25 million threshold that you mentioned, is that adjusted for inflation over time?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it is. It is adjusted for inflation over time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So,
thank you guys.
Great, and I hope that you have a safe flight. So with that, we are going to move into the second phase of this webinar, in which we are going to be hearing from 3 speakers who have been involved in the practical application of natural infrastructure to support the provision of municipal and ecosystem services. So our first presenter is Nasha Spence from the City of Saskatoon, with their environmental accounting, or sorry, where she's their environmental accounting manager. And she is going to be speaking about the City of Saskatoon's green infrastructure strategy. So Nasha, welcome back actually to a PRAC webinar.
Thank you very much. Now, do you have my presentation on your screen? Sorry.
I can pull it up if you want, Nasha.
Yeah, sorry. I thought that it was just going to be on your screen. So if that's okay, that would be my preference.
Sorry about that. Give me 1 sec, Nasha.
Sure. I can try to get it up on mine too. Oh, it looks like I'm going to beat you to it.
It's a race.
I feel like we should have some elevator music in the background. Sorry about that, folks.
I'm kind of a singer. I apologize.
All right. So is everybody looking at my screen then?
You are just on presenter view. So if you could flip your...
Oh. And how do I do that? Sorry.
If you right click on your display settings at the top. Yeah.
Oh. Okay, well, now the pressure's off for everybody. Whenever they do any presentations, just think back about this day and you'll feel better about it. So I'll just get started here. So I am Nasha Spence. I'm the Environmental Accounting Manager at the City of Saskatoon. And I just wanted to speak to you about a pilot valuation project that we're implementing on the city's natural infrastructure. So I'll talk to you about the purpose of the project itself, and then walk through the reasons and the methodology for evaluation. The natural asset valuation fits into the overall climate action plan and green strategy initiatives within Saskatoon. So it's currently residing in the local actions portfolio, which is our adaptation portfolio. It is closely related to green strategy, and that's a project that's strategizing how we use green and natural infrastructure in the city's short and long-term development plans and operations. So at the outset, I feel I should mention that I understand the conflictual nature of applying a dollar value to natural assets. It's like applying a dollar value to life. but the green assets do cost money to safeguard. And similar to any other asset, a dollar is a universal language to communicate inherent value. So for those who do have a little bit of difficulty with applying that dollar value to natural infrastructure, ideally it's just one of many forms that you would use to communicate the need for investment or compensation if those assets are impaired. One of the things that our city finds as a restraint during our budget is that there may be many costs to natural spaces that are neither accounted for or they're not budgeted for. So if natural spaces and natural assets are valued, this is a really good way to start budgeting for real costs. Also, we find that the community values natural infrastructure for reasons that may not be intrinsically, like they just might not be evident. So like that would include things like beauty or recreation, but the community generally doesn't connect these inherent values with what we might see on financial statements. Evaluation can identify where it may be more cost effective or value effective to use green assets instead of engineered assets. Just like tangible capital assets, changes in value can alert the asset management team to risks and changing condition. So it helps create a more preventative approach rather than a risk response approach. As an aside, I should mention that our team is attempting to create methods that any municipality could use to do climate modeling and resiliency and to value your natural infrastructure. So if you do have questions, I'd encourage you to reach out to us. Climate modeling was a risk and vulnerability assessment that we did for all of our gray, green, and natural infrastructure in Saskatoon. Our climate modeling is regionally specific, and it identifies the effect that climate change will have on city infrastructure. So this allows us to better predict the natural asset life cycles. So unsurprisingly, Saskatoon can expect a warmer, wetter, and wilder region. As part of a solid asset management framework, we believe that climate modeling should be incorporated into the life cycle analysis of all of our city infrastructure. We're seeing that municipalities are increasingly looking to natural and green infrastructure to replace engineered infrastructure because often it's more resilient and it has a less expensive life cycle. This isn't always the case, but green and natural infrastructure does provide an option. Evaluation will enable our teams to decide if a natural option is financially comparable to a gray option. For example, our swales and wetlands are creating flooding and wildfire buffers for our municipality. So Dimple spoke in her introduction about natural versus green infrastructure. Many times we can report green infrastructure on our financial statements, but currently there aren't really standards to reporting natural infrastructure on the financial statements themselves. So some of the risks around this process includes perhaps imperfect methodology for a new area of work. There are some buy-in barriers, particularly from finance. So for example, why spend the money to value a tree at $1,000 when we can replace it for $60? Value and use mean different things to different residents, and it's not very objective. The use of principles and professional judgment is sometimes uncomfortable for those that prefer hard rules, but to be clear, accountants regularly value intangible assets, so the concept isn't unpracticed. We're communicating value that is non-financial and indirect. For example, the value of a tree may not be critical, but if you have an urban forest network, then you're positively affecting health and well-being. But that's difficult to measure and draw the connection for the community. And lastly, valuing natural infrastructure can be seen as either pioneer accounting or rogue accounting, depending on your perspective. To give a summary of where we're at with evaluation, we've selected our standards, we've completed our inventory of the asset types we will value, and we're currently listing out the ecosystem services of those assets. So the next step is going to be applying a dollar value to those services. The standard for the valuation is based on the system of environmental economic accounting. The framework looks at flows, stocks, and relates the assets to economic activity. The major limitation here is that it's consumer-based, which it readily acknowledges, but the flow of assets relates more to use through consumption rather than experience. For example, the framework uses the term timber to reflect forestry products, whereas a municipality would use forestry or canopy to reflect the experiential use rather than consumptive use. So to respond to that, the central framework is complemented by the EEA. So this is focusing on assets as consumptive. It identifies the integrated use and benefits of the assets in a geographical way. So this system includes types, conditions, so it outlines the quality and key indicators, services, who are the beneficiaries of the assets, monetary accounts, so it outlines what your stocks and flows might be, and then your thematic accounts. So we're looking at valuing one swale and one wetland in the city. Once a valuation has been applied and verified, we're then going to apply it to the other assets within Saskatoon. So as we're creating this framework, we're developing our inventories for the natural infrastructure. So what we've been finding is that we actually don't know how many wetlands that we have in Saskatoon. Swales are relatively easy because of the size, but creating the inventory has actually been pretty time consuming. So this is a map of the swales and wetlands within Saskatoon. The brown sections are the swales and the dark blue are the wetlands. If you can see the red outlines, we're also starting to identify our natural areas. We do have a natural area standards project, which is developing standards for natural areas, which requires defining the assets fairly distinctly. And this is helping with evaluation because then we can have a better understanding of our asset types and classes. This map is of just the swales and grasslands in city limits. We're valuing the small swale, which I've circled in green here. We do have 4 swales in city limits, and then the brown square on the far right is a grassland. Interestingly, the northeast or the northernmost swale that I've circled in purple there is privately owned and currently under some controversy regarding development. So as you can imagine, evaluation of the current swales may help with preserving the space and instead develop around this site by identifying the benefits of incorporating natural infrastructure into development practices. Also, destruction of natural infrastructure is inevitable during development, so evaluation will help with compensation calculations. This is a map of the wetlands within Saskatoon. The wetland being valued is circled in green and it's at your bottom left side. We chose this wetland because there's talk about development in that area of the city, and there's some conversation with what to do with the marsh that's also in that area. It's just adjacent. The wetland is also fairly close to the landfill, so once a baseline is developed, we can understand if the landfill is affecting the health of the wetland overall. This is a wetlands map that has the wetlands categorized by class. The classes used will be the same for the natural area standards as for the valuation itself, just to keep everything consistent. It was too difficult for this accountant not to have a spreadsheet in here, so I apologize. But I wanted to give you an example of how the inventory itself is being built. This is a really foundational piece right here. One complication of the valuation that we're finding is where to draw those lines between the asset and not the asset. So do we include a buffer? How big should the buffer be? Where exactly are we drawing those lines? So our first phase won't be to draw those lines very clearly. It's just going to be a general value on that space in a more general way. But as you can imagine, this process of putting putting these assets in a spreadsheet and starting to get them some parameters around them is a pretty time-consuming process. So this is where the University of Saskatchewan is coming in. They have a project team that's valuing infrastructure using drones and a set of metrics that are very similar to those that we are using. So our plan is to compare our results. Once that's done, then we can develop a life cycle timeline to test those values over time. Certainly the assets will need to continue being tested so we can recognize impairment and appreciation, but the drone methodology is a good way to get the inventory together and to create the maintenance, renewal, and replacement timelines. I don't want to present the university's material. This is a public report though, and I thought you might be interested in knowing what some of their results are. So they're a little bit further along than we are. They have valued the northeast swale, and it's the largest swale that we have in the city. They are working on the small swale right now so that our results should be ready at around the same time. But their initial value of the northeast swale came in at approximately $1.6 million. And they included all of the component parts that you're seeing on your screen there. So just to wrap up, there were a number of groups that supported the data that we've produced for the climate change modeling, our resiliency work, and then the valuation itself. We've certainly involved as many groups as we can in order to ensure that our results are collaborative and informed, and again, so that they can be reused, especially for smaller municipalities that don't necessarily have the resources to complete this work. And that was it for me. So I look forward to some questions.
Great, thank you very much, Nasha. And I was just about to remind everyone that you can please to ask your questions through the question box in the software, and we will be looking at those after our next set of presentations. And those will be given that's going to be focusing on the partnership that has been established between the Town of Cochrane and the Miistakis Institute using natural infrastructure to mitigate flood and drought. So the first speaker is going to be Guy Greenaway, a senior project manager at the Miistakis Institute, and he will be followed by Amanda Legros, a planner for the Town of Cochrane. So I'm looking forward to hearing about this case study and from both of our panelists. So Guy, if I can turn the screen over to you.
Great, thanks very much. I'll just let everybody know that I'm going to move through the information pretty quickly just in the interest of time, but the presentation will be available afterwards for anybody who wants to see it. There'll be a couple of pieces I'll skip over, but that will be, like I said, available in the presentation in case you want to see that or ask me questions about that later. So just to make sure, okay. The Miistakis Institute, the institute with the most difficult to pronounce name, I know. We're a research institute that's also a nonprofit charitable organization. We're based at Mount Royal University in Calgary. I won't go through all of the details of our organization, but our website, rockies.ca, has all of the information about the work that we do. One of the things that we have been working on is this Working with Nature project, and what I'm going to go through today is just describe some of the background reasons, but that's all been very well articulated by the previous speakers. It's the same issues, the same cases. Describe what the process is that's founded around a workbook and then a workshop mechanism that we use with municipalities, and we've targeted this at the small to medium-sized municipalities, slightly different but specific audience. This section on natural infrastructure mapping I am going to skip right over, like I said, just in the interest of time, but I just want to highlight some of the lessons that we've learned and mention quickly what we're going to do for our next steps with the Working with Nature project. So why we created it, context that everybody understands, we're dealing with a number of flood and drought issues, especially exacerbated by climate change, and the responsibility for adapting to that is falling in some ways disproportionately to municipalities. natural infrastructure increasingly seen as a key part of the solution, but the awareness of how to do that. I originally wrote this as the awareness is low, but that's not right. The awareness is spotty. There's lots of areas where people are very aware, areas where people are not, even within the same municipality. What's missing is the support for municipalities who are trying to apply the natural infrastructure approach. And I'm glad to have seen all of the resources that have been mentioned previously, so I don't have to go through any of those kinds of things. The need, as we saw it, was obviously a decision support tool for municipalities, one that would fit within existing municipal processes, so you don't have to create a new department, a new policy, one that works across departments and across policies. Often these kinds of issues are slotted down into one particular department, conservation or environment or parks will take this on. We have in the past created what we call discovery tools. One example is Adaptation that we created a few years ago, which are really just about understanding the issue in more detail and understanding the possibilities of actions that a municipality can take. But what we wanted with this tool was go a step further and provide a decision-making process. One that has a simple and inexpensive interface. We didn't want to make it something that was going to require specialized software, specialized training, specialized support. And the real key thing is being able to real world test it, which led to the partnership with the Town of Cochrane, Alberta, who have been amazing partners in this project. And we have learned an incredible amount from them and have been able to put all of that into the tool itself. So the working with nature process is a pretty straightforward process at a high level. Start with doing background research on what we mean by natural assets or natural infrastructure assets and being clear on that. There's been a lot of discussion thus far about how it should be defined, and I think the really important component is clarity on the definition, what we mean by that, and especially when we're working with a particular municipality. Then taking that list of possible types, and we start by doing an inventory assessment for the municipality, again, just listing what all of those are and some of the services it can provide. Do you have those things? Where might they exist? A preliminary assessment of the risks and hazards, and then we take them through a workshop process. And the fundamental role of that workshop is to populate the workbook and to guide the municipality through populating the workbook, which leads to creating a set of actions that the municipality can take on. What we actually added after that process was also a prioritization process, because that's a challenge that everybody faces. We have a long list of things that we have to do or need to do. How do we prioritize that? So the workbook itself follows that same kind of structure. There's exercises, mechanisms, instructions for identifying very specifically the goals and principles of what you're doing, a hazard assessment, so being able to identify what the bad situations are that you're concerned about, and the risk assessment, the losses that you might incur from those bad situations. Again, the natural infrastructure identification, the natural infrastructure mapping specific to that municipality, guiding them through a process, again, across departments of identifying what kinds of actions they would want to take in terms of maximizing the use of their natural infrastructure. So that's everything from identifying to specific activities, to new programs, policy changes, the whole spectrum. And there's a whole mechanism for kind of splitting all of that out. I too love spreadsheets. So this whole thing is actually based on an Excel spreadsheet where there are tabs that are associated with each one of these tasks, of things to fill in, things to work through, and then tabs that are associated with the instructions and the information. So the guidance. We were originally going to create a separate guidance document, but instead all of that guidance is going to be incorporated right within the workbook itself. So then we go through the workshop process, and we've gone through this with the Town of Cochrane. We present all of that background research to give them a basic understanding of the things they already know. It's to take that information and collect it in a more specific way. It serves two purposes, gives them information, but it also is information that they will then be able to use when they're developing case statements or business cases, or when they're trying to present information to the public, that they have that all in one place. Then walk them through the workbook and filling in each one of those components of the workbook, and then ultimately leave them in a position to be able to move forward on their own with the workbook. So the agenda just follows that same thing, goals and principles and risk assessment. The way we did it was to have those as more information pieces, and then really dive people into the activities of natural infrastructure asset identification and the action plan strategizing. We had them break out into groups with maps of the town itself, and prompted with the information that they'd been provided early in the workshop about what we mean by natural infrastructure assets, have them go through and identify for themselves. And again, two purposes. One, so there is a catalog and inventory, but also it helps them work through the process of understanding what does exist within our community and what do we mean by that. And then working through all of the actions, there's a number of components to each one of those actions that they have to figure out to make them practical actions. The piece that, like I said, I'm going to just skip through fairly quickly here, just in the interest of time, is the natural infrastructure mapping and some of the challenges that we identified, and then some of the opportunities that we've identified around that. Some of our lessons learned, sometimes it's lessons relearned or lessons re-emphasized. Setting the stage, so like I said, really clear about the role and the benefits of natural infrastructure versus built or gray infrastructure. Again, what we mean by those things, but also not to pretend that we're suggesting abandon your whole gray infrastructure programs and switch over here, but how those things might be clearly integrated. I'm glad that there's been a number of mentions of heat island effect and wildfire, and in our area in particular, we basically live in an irrigated desert, so drought is a far bigger issue, but it produces fewer headlines. So constantly trying to move people to be considering droughts as much as considering the flood issues. The program mechanics, again, this is a sort of lesson re-emphasized, is having the local lead, a champion, and you're going to hear from her in just a second, Amanda, who's been great in being the shepherd at the Town of Cochrane. One of the things that we realized with the workbook pretty early on was don't just start with blank slates. We tried to pre-fill as much as possible without biasing anything, but just to prime the pump and make sure that they were able to hit the ground running a little bit and have clarity on what was supposed to go in any of those places. A recognition that there has to be facilitation, and this is very much one of our lessons learned, is we have put too much on one workshop in the effort to try and reduce the burden on the municipality, and we've come up with a new mechanism how we're going to do that in the future. Similarly, the prioritization process, which we ended up unexpectedly creating an entire prioritization process, which I think will be helpful and robust, but was not something that was there in the early stages. And then this one that we keep coming back to, we originally conceived, could this just be an online thing that people fill in by themselves? It's an automatic generated outputs, and really we keep coming back to the conclusion, there's no autopilot. These things need some facilitation, some help, some support, especially for busy municipalities who this may not be on the top of their list, or there may not be enough room on the plate to do that comprehensively. Moving forward, one of the things, again, that I was glad to see crop up here and there in the previous presentations is there tends to be a lot of discussion around natural infrastructure, around flood and drought, but we keep getting pushback around, well, we identify this as natural infrastructure because it's really important for biodiversity and really important for habitat, and that may be the primary concern for them. It may have some secondary flood and drought applications, or maybe very limited, but having that broader conception of natural infrastructure is really important. Again, it's come up repeatedly in the presentations. We're talking about natural infrastructure asset literacy and creating more of that, raising that within municipalities, but it's the same thing with risk management literacy, because really this is about the intersection of both of those things. So the next steps for us are continue with the project with the Town of Cochrane and finish that project with Cochrane, translate all of our user guide information directly into the workbook and finish that workbook, and then provide a webinar for Alberta municipalities or whomever wants to be part of it on how you would use the Working with Nature workbook. Again, we're a nonprofit charitable organization. We will just be putting this out to all municipalities for them to be able to use as they want. Again, I skipped over this, but I think that one of the key gaps and needs for municipalities is going to be increasingly support for mapping their natural infrastructure and understanding how they might do that with existing data, with new data needs perhaps, but having that base information to enter in a lot of the other initiatives that everybody else has been talking about. Saskatoon really emphasized that need as well, that how do you gather that information, how do you have that base that base data for your decision. And I'm just going to finish off by thanking the Working with Nature funders, the Government of Alberta, and specifically their Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program. And again, this will be in the circulated presentations, but that's my contact information if anybody has any questions. But with that, I will pass it over to Amanda.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So just a forewarning, there is some construction going on in our office, so if it gets too loud, just let me know and I can adjust. So today, as Guy mentioned, I'm going to be talking about our experience as a pilot community for Miistakis Working with Nature project. So during my presentation, I'll briefly talk about Cochrane and where we're located, why we wanted to participate in this project. I might skip our anticipated outcomes just due to time. And then I'll move on to what's working in the project so far and some lessons that we learned. So the town of Cochrane is located in southern Alberta. We are located along Highway 1A, 35 kilometers west of downtown Calgary and 100 kilometers east of the town of Banff. According to our 2019 census, we have a population of 29,277. This is a map of the town of Cochrane. We are located within the Bow River Basin, and we have multiple rivers and creeks within our borders. The main water bodies are the Bow River, which runs west to east through town, Jumping Pound Creek, which is located, which connects to the Bow River actually in the west of our town, and Big Hill Creek, which is located in the north of town. So we decided to participate in the project for several different reasons. The first
Amanda.
is, sorry?
Sorry to interrupt. Would you just be able to speak a little louder? Some people online are having trouble hearing.
Oh, sure. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay. So we decided to participate in the project for several different reasons. The first is because we have been impacted by floods in the past. Jumping Pound Creek flooded near the Bow River in 2005, and the Bow River flooded in 2013. Both floods resulted in damage to surrounding properties. We also wanted to understand how climate change could impact the town and learn ways to be prepared for future events. We also wanted to understand the potential regional impact and learn ways to become a more resilient community. And finally, we are updating our municipal development plan and sustainability plan in the next couple years, and we were hoping to include flood and drought mitigation goals and regulations within these documents. So I am going to skip these because we are running out of time. I believe so far the project has been successful for many different reasons. The first is that we had at least one representative from each town department attend the workshop. This helped us have in-depth conversations during the workshop and resulted in a diverse list of action items as everyone had their own ideas based on the areas of focus and expertise. Second, the workshop and workbook created by Miistakis was informative and easy to follow. The workshop provided an environment where everyone felt comfortable to ask questions and provide comments. The information sheets were also invaluable as they provided background information to help guide us through the workbook and workshop, especially because everyone had different levels of knowledge with regards to natural infrastructure. One thing that did come out of the workshop, which I think will be helpful for the town, is turning the mapping exercise into a natural infrastructure layer within our GIS software. And this will allow all employees to see and reference a map of our natural infrastructure when working on projects in the future. And finally, everything about Cochrane's natural infrastructure, as well as possible action items and projects to help mitigate flood and drought, will be located within one electronic document, which will make it easier to update and use as a reference tool across all departments in the future. So the project was successful, but with any project, you do learn some things along the way. Some of these Guy did touch upon already. The first is that it is important to outline everyone's role at the beginning of the project, and to identify a project lead, as they will be the ones to do a lot of the background work throughout the process, which includes prepping for the workshop and compiling results afterwards. Guy did touch on this, but it may be helpful to have more time to do the workshop. We did it in one afternoon, so we did propose that it might be good to have either a full day workshop or two separate ones, one for the education portion and one for the action items, so you can get more in depth on both of those items. We also realized the importance of a prioritization process. So when we were reviewing our action items, we realized that there was no way to determine which item should be addressed first or which item would have the most impact. As a municipality, we also felt it would be important to include potential costs and anticipated time for each action item as a consideration within this process. And as Guy mentioned, we are working through that now. And finally, we realized the importance of going into the project with idea of what you want to do with the workbook afterwards. So currently, we are trying to figure that out as a town as we're coming to the end of the project. Ideally, we would like to create an official town document based on the information in the workbook, but due to time and resources within the town right now, it'll probably just be a resource when updating other documents in the future. So in conclusion, we are looking forward to finalizing this with Miistakis and having that complete document. And we feel that this project has provided us with new information and a resource that we can move forward with regards to natural infrastructure within our borders. And my contact information is on the slide if you have any questions after the webinar. And that's it for me. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda and Guy, for your presentation about the interesting process that you have underway. At this point in time, I will note that we were planning to wrap up the webinar at 3:15, which means we have relatively little time, but on our side here at the PRAC, it's easy for us to extend, and I'm hoping it'll also be possible for the presenters to allow us a few minutes to go over time so that we can address some of the questions that have been raised by the participants. So if we can sort of switch over into the question period for now. One of the first questions I have is for Nasha. There's a question regarding the health and whether or not health and wellness indicators were captured in the environmental counting and valuation of your natural infrastructure in Saskatoon.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in our standards themselves, it is included. It isn't expressly outlined in the standards, however. So when we're doing the natural area standards and the green strategy, health, culture, and recreation are some of those additional components that we had identified as offering value. So because they're not expressly outlined in the standard, we'll be adding those component parts independently. The other thing is that the university's valuation is really comprehensive. They've done a really good job on it. So where we feel like ours might not be adequate, then we can always fall back on theirs, or if we feel that ours has a little bit more legs around than theirs, then we'll flip back and forth. So the short answer is yes.
Great, thank you. Another question was asked around forest fires and whether anyone is looking at natural infrastructure and air quality issues from forest fires as part of this work around natural infrastructure. And before opening up that question to the panelists, I'll just note that at the beginning of her presentation, it was noted by Andrea, thank you, that the Intact Center is planning to do some more work around wildfire. So if they have not been able to produce analysis on that yet, there will be more analysis on that forthcoming from the Intact Center. Does anybody else have any comments they'd like to make around wildland fire and forest fires?
I'll just throw in something briefly. This is Guy from Miistakis. That we haven't covered off the air quality components of that. What we've been covering off has been the green area component of that. We sort of look at the assets and the services provided from the assets, and that's been a significant thing, and is showing up even in the pilot with Cochrane. The areas that are maintained in a certain manner. So sometimes it's green space, sometimes it's setbacks of trees, but all of those with a consideration of wildfire mitigation.
Thank you. Guy, if you can also answer the next question that has arisen, that is, well, when you think your workbook will be available for municipalities to use?
That's a good question. Was it my boss who asked that question? I think that we are aiming to have the workbook ready in the fall. We're finishing up the work with Cochrane right now to make sure we maximize the lessons from what Cochrane is going through. Skip the summer season in terms of trying to do a webinar at a time. We might miss everybody, but then early in the fall, be able to have that finalized and have the webinar. We have some question marks around timing with our support as well, but that's kind of where our goal is right now. We will make that, once that happens, we make that available through our newsletter, through our website, through Twitter announcements and that sort of thing. So we'll be making hopefully as many people as possible aware of it through those mechanisms as well.
Great, thank you. I next have a more complicated question, I think, which is about sort of the understanding of the relationship between wetlands and flooding. And the observation has been that the literature points to wetlands, and some say that it has a positive benefit on reducing risk. Some say it doesn't have a great impact on flood risk, and some claiming that it can increase the risk of flooding, and some say that it can be a mix of it, or positive, negative, or neutral, depending upon the situation. To support that observation is noticed that some of the most major floods on the prairies have happened in the 1800s, when of course there was a greater abundance of wetlands within the region. So I think maybe I'm going to ask Dimple if she wants to comment on that question and that issue.
So yeah, I don't know a lot of details about when wetlands will not provide some sort of buffer to flooding, but in the context of the prairies, where we've lost so many of our wetlands and we've lost that buffering capacity, the fairly resounding evidence is that we need to maintain many of our wetlands and restore as many as possible in order to provide those buffers. And in the case of Pelly's Lake that I highlighted, it's also creating some of those retention areas where water tends to go when we have these surface floods, and create some of those areas as kind of deliberate naturalized water retention sites. So I'm not really answering the question, but here the evidence has been, here on the prairies, the evidence has been that wetlands are generally contributing to improved buffering of flooding.
Right, thank you.
Can I add something onto that as well?
Of course.
So I think a couple of components there. First of all, the historical change in flooding patterns, it's difficult to look at that because of the dramatic increase in flood control mechanisms that have been implemented over that period of time. So, for example, City of Calgary, the downtown used to flood constantly, and now it floods very rarely because of the upstream controls, the dams that are there. The issue that we're facing now is that we're overtapping a lot of those control mechanisms. So we're sort of dealing with two different issues at the same time in terms of the wetlands. The comment about it being very location specific is very, very true. There's no question that certain wetlands in certain places can play a different role than certain wetlands in other places. But there also is no question that wetlands have a tremendous capacity to store and to reduce flow. And I don't think that there's any disagreement in the literature about that. I think the disagreement in the literature comes down to some of those more site-specific considerations. And as an example, City of Calgary did a source water protection plan, looked upstream to consider the impact of the wetlands upstream. And one of the things that confounded their estimates was they assumed a time period when wetlands were frozen. So the flood capacity ability of wetlands when they're frozen over versus when they're not is obviously dramatically different. So I think that yes, we can find circumstances where it is the case that the potential might be mixed, but in general, the ability now, as we overtap all of our other storage systems and climate change comes forward, wetlands provide, I think, an arguably viable option for storing water on the landscape.
Well, thank you, Guy and Dimple, for addressing that question. Next, we have a question for Nasha regarding the valuation of the northeastern swale that you highlighted in your presentation. The question is the valuation a cost that could theoretically be paid to the owner or by the landowner?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
So with the valuation you're doing of the northeastern swale, is the valuation of that cost, if it was, I assume that if there was a change in that use of that swale, would the cost theoretically be paid to the owner or by the landowner?
Okay, so it depends on what the next phase would be. So for example, if the landowner was to sell to a developer and the developer is developing out the land adjacent to the swale, basically what you would find, similar to most other municipalities, is that cost is passed on to the developer. So then when they develop and resell those lots are significantly increased in value because they border a green space. And so where residents are now willing to pay more for that lot, part of the value of that lot also includes if there are some compensation expenses that now have to be considered. So that's really similar to what you would find right now. It's just that right now you wouldn't necessarily have a compensation value. So if, for example, in building an overpass, we are destroying a wetland, we might have a compensation value that we've put aside to recreate a similar space someplace else, but we have no benchmark for what value that compensation might be. So I hope that addressed the question.
Thank you, Nasha. I hope it does as well. Fine. There's just one final question. It actually is for Dimple. And I think is recalling the fact that you work at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, that there's a lot of work focusing on farmers and small businesses in developing countries. And are there examples you could provide in which natural infrastructure work in those countries is being undertaken, or reports or projects that look at the role of natural infrastructure in supporting ecosystem services and adaptation in developing countries?
Thank you for that. I have not looked specifically at this topic in the international context recently, but yes, we've been looking at ecosystem services and different versions of payments for ecosystem services in the context of watersheds over the years. And there are many examples of where people have talked about specific benefits from things like wetlands and how beneficiaries are in fact able to identify and pay for some of those ecosystem services. So if you do leave contact information, I'm happy to kind of dig up some of those examples and provide them to you. But yeah, we haven't looked at them as recently in the context of natural infrastructure and how those ecological systems might provide some of the infrastructure benefits that we're beginning to highlight more and more. But we have talked about how ecosystem services are being kind of enhanced and optimized and managed in the context of developing countries in other studies in the past.
Great. Thank you, Dimple. And with that, I think it's going to be time to wrap up this webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I particularly like to give an extra thank you to our presenters today, Dimple, Andrea, Nasha, Guy, and Amanda. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Cameron Hunter and Ann Rubin, for their work on organizing this webinar. We have recorded the conversation today, and we will be posting it along with the presentations on the PRAC website. You will be receiving a short evaluation survey, and we would like you very much to fill it out as it helps us inform the work that we are doing. We'll also be sharing the survey in a follow-up email. And in terms of the PRAC's plans going forward, we are expecting to do a regional workshop again this fall, and we will be providing information about that in the coming weeks. So we will hope that you will stay tuned to find out how it is that you can participate. And with that, I will let you go and enjoy the rest of the day. So thank you very much.